I'd like to introduce now our guest, and Governor Christine Todd Whitman is joining us as a keynote speaker for our climate change education project. This, if you're lucky enough to be sitting at a table with some of the commentaries, we started it earlier this year because we were very concerned about what was coming out of certain areas of Georgia as far as getting climate change regulation, and we wanted to make sure that we have the facts out there. Christine Todd Whitman is a highly respected leader and advisor on environmental issues, these affecting communities, nations, and private industries. Of course, you know she served in the cabinet of President George W. Bush. She was EPA Administrator from 2001 to 2003. Before that, she served 7 years as governor of New Jersey, and she was the first woman elected in that position in state history. Since 2006, she's been co-chair of the Clean and Safe Energy Coalition, which is a national grassroots coalition of more than 2,200 members that unites unlikely allies across the business, environmental, academic, consumer, and labor community to support nuclear energy, clean and safe energy. The coalition believes that nuclear energy can improve energy security, ensure clean air, and enhance the quality of life and economic well-being of all Americans. And Governor Whitman and Dr. Patrick Moore, who is a co-founder and former leader of Greenpeace, are co-chairs of that organization. You can find it at www.cleansafeenergy.org. She's going to be talking today about the case for clean energy. And I'd like to welcome Governor Whitman to Georgia, and we'll look forward to hearing from her.
Thank you, Benita, very much for that kind introduction, and I am delighted to be able to be with you this afternoon, part of this Policy Forum's discussion on climate change and education. And as you've heard, I would like to discuss a little bit about clean energy and how that factors into the entire discussion that we are having and that you've been having. I want to also thank Rogers Wade and Kelly McCutcheon and also the many other sponsors of this event for making it possible, because this is what's so important to good policy making, is the ability to have an informed discussion, hear different opinions, and know what the parameters of the discussion are going to be and what the trade-offs for any decision that's got to be made are going to entail. I am here today to make the case for clean energy. And to me, the rationale for pursuing clean energy is self-evident. I don't think there should be any much question about it. This country is in dire need of new energy sources. I mean, we face an increasing demand for new energy. We have to meet it, and those sources in meeting it, I believe, should be carbon-free. To the extent that we are able to ensure that we are providing clean energy, we ought to do everything we can. By 2030, according to the Department of Energy, the United States will see an increase in demand of 21%. That's on top of the energy demand that we already have in our everyday lives. And that's a lot, with our BlackBerries and our laptops and our refrigerators and air conditioners all requiring electricity. We're looking at a future that is only going to see an exponential increase in that demand as we come up with the next wave of new technology, the next set of new things that are going to improve our lives and increase our economy, but demand more energy. We need to look at a portfolio of energy sources to meet that demand. We are a society that loves to be told that if you just invest in this one thing, that's the silver bullet that will solve all your problems. Do this and you're all going to be fine. It's not that way. We need all forms of energy to meet the demand that's coming at us. There is no one silver bullet, and while Case Energy is clearly a proponent of nuclear energy, that's not going to be the be-all, end-all. It just needs to be part of an overall portfolio. Wind and other renewable resources such as solar have got to be part of our energy mix going forward. Indeed, it's likely that they are going to provide more energy than they do now, but they're still intermittent sources of power. We haven't yet figured out how to store that energy, to put them into base power. And we're an ever-on world. I mean, we demand our power 24/7, and we have to be able to provide that power if we're going to see the kind of economic growth that we want to see for this country and this state. And I believe we want to do it without emitting greenhouse gases or other regulated pollutants. That's for our overall health. To satisfy the dual requirements of generating electricity and of meeting our U.S. demand and reducing greenhouse gases and improving other pollutants and reducing other emissions, we need to look at all those sources, and I believe that nuclear should be one of the focal points of our energy policy, along with conservation and increased energy efficiency as a way to meet our coming demands. I think we have to say up front and recognize up front that any effort to boost energy production while cutting emissions is going to cost money. Now, I will say to you, anything that we do to ensure that we have a steady flow of energy is going to cost money, even if we don't add another kilowatt of power, because our infrastructure demands repair. It's going to need work. We have to realize that our energy prices will go up, whether it's from nuclear, wind, solar, or clean coal. We're going to see that happen. But putting money into nuclear, we believe, Patrick Moore and I and those who support Case Energy, is an investment worth making, notwithstanding the high capital costs for building new reactors, and no one's trying to hide those. That increased cost is going to be true for any kind of new power that we bring online. But I believe one of the important ways to decide whether or not it's a kind of investment you want to make is to look at what the long-term cost of that power is going to be. What are you going to get on that investment? In 2008, U.S. electric utilities spent an average of 1.87 cents per kilowatt of power from nuclear energy. And that's compared with 8.09 cents of for natural gas and 17.26 cents for petroleum. Because nuclear power is fueled by uranium, a source that we have in this country, and we have quite a bit of it, again, it is something that isn't subject to the same kind of price volatility that you find in areas and sources that we have to import, where we don't control the source of that power to the extent that we do. When we do import uranium, it's from Canada and Australia. Those aren't enemy countries, not yet anyway. I mean, we could do it again to Canada, but we haven't yet. And here in this state, you have taken some steps that are going to be very important, but they were controversial. The pay-it-forward approach will yield savings, subsequent savings of some $300 million to the ratepayers here in the state of Georgia. It won't have to, it's not going to come in one shot at the end of the period when you bring that power online, and that's going to help mitigate that overall cost, and you have the cost of money today versus what the cost of money will be in the future when the plant comes online. It saves money, and it's going to help, I believe, you here in Georgia attract and retain energy-using businesses. The other side of nuclear that we talk about whenever Patrick and I are out speaking for Case Energy is the job side of it. When you consider what's happened in the nation with unemployment and what's happened particularly here in Georgia, since July of 2008, manufacturing and construction have been amongst the hardest hit of your businesses, industries here, and manufacturing has lost some over 52,000 jobs. Construction has shed over 36,000 jobs here in the state of New Jersey, Georgia. Not New Jersey anymore. You're not in Kansas, Dorothy. That's where nuclear energy, again, comes into play. And it's a good news story from the jobs perspective. During construction, nuclear reactors at the high point in construction will have 4,500 construction workers working on site. Once a reactor is up and running, it's between 800 and 1,200 people who work full-time at that utility. And those aren't jobs that are going somewhere else. Those are jobs that are going to stay. And that is important. Right now, today, here in Georgia, with the prospect of Plant Vogel's 2 new reactors, those jobs are starting right now as they clear the site and get ready for it. It's not something that you have to wait 8 to 10 years to see. Those jobs will start to happen. Earlier this month, as you know, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued the early site permit for the 2 new reactors at Plant Vogel near Augusta. And that permit essentially determines that the site is supportable and appropriate for a new generating unit and allows for that preliminary construction work. But that's just the beginning. The other side of the thing about the jobs, the nuclear energy jobs, the full-time jobs, that they pay better than similar jobs in the local community. They pay a lot. And they are the kinds of jobs for which many of your universities here in Georgia are training people today, giving them the opportunity to see a real future. The other side, beside the construction jobs and the maintenance jobs and the operating jobs of new reactors, is the fact that you have an aging workforce in our nuclear industry today, and you have about 35% of the nation's current nuclear workforce eligible to retire within the next 5 years. Again, those are jobs that are happening right now, even if no new nuclear reactor comes online. The potential here is enormous for good paying jobs. By 2012, it is estimated nationwide that the nuclear industry will provide job opportunities for almost 20,000 new workers in the nuclear industry. Then that's from just new reactors coming online, it's almost 20,000, but it's 6,300 nationwide due to attrition. And it's the same kinds of numbers that you'll see the ratio here in Georgia. Between new nuclear power and the aging workforce, we're looking at a possible creation of thousands of jobs in this state alone. That's something to be considered in the equation when determining whether or not this is the appropriate way for Georgia to go. The economic benefits of nuclear power don't stop with the jobs alone. Each of this country's 104 reactors generates nearly $40 million a year in total labor income and some $430 million a year in total output for the local communities. That's one reason why the local neighbors of nuclear reactors are so positive about nuclear power and construction, and they see them as drivers of economic growth. They see them as good neighbors who have been good for their communities. Georgia is already taking the lead in our nation to become environmentally responsible. You're starting to take the steps that are so important. The statewide recycling campaign to raise awareness of recycling formed a program that helps small business comply with environmental requirements and created industrial materials exchange that helps reduce energy usage and helps with that overall recycling and conservation that are going to be so important to meeting our energy needs as we go forward. To that end, talking about clean energy, those 4 nuclear reactors here in Georgia provide 23.1% of your power, but 85% of your clean energy that you have here in the state. To put that in some other terms, Georgia has avoided the emission of 27 million metric tons in carbon dioxide in 2007 from the operation of those plants. That, if you put it even in different terms, that's the equivalent of taking some 2 million passenger cars off the roads. That's a real impact. Those are real numbers, and they make a difference. They make a difference to human health. They make a difference to the health of our environment. And Georgia is also leading the way in building new plants as one of the first states where you've received early site permit from the NRC. That puts you in the forefront. The citizens of Georgia, frankly, I believe, have a reason to be proud of what they're doing and how they're showing the nation the way to go forward. I co-chair, as was pointed out in the introduction, something called CASE Energy, Clean and Safe Energy Coalition. I co-chair it with Dr. Patrick Moore. When we were asked to do this, and Patrick Moore, as you heard, was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, that doesn't, and I will say this up front, does not mean that Greenpeace supports nuclear energy. It does not. It has, in fact, totally denounced Patrick Moore. They've even taken him off their website as one of the co-founders when they go back into the history of the founding of Greenpeace, which is kind of stretching things, I think, a little bit to take him out entirely, but he's a non-person. But Patrick is an environmentalist who really cares about the environment. He's also a scientist. And as he looked at these issues and said, if we care about clean air, if we're going to make an issue and care about global climate change, and we understand the need for power and more power, because we all use it, we all have our iPods, we all have our Blackberries, then we have got to be responsible in how we look at meeting those needs, and you can't keep saying this to the environmental community, you can't keep saying, no way, no how are we going to consider nuclear. What we were asked to do as co-founders of CASE Energy was to lead a coalition that would help get facts out about nuclear energy, not to lobby for a particular reactor, not to lobby on Capitol Hill, we don't do that, but to talk about how important, what the decisions are that you have to make, what are the real facts behind nuclear, what is the history of nuclear in this country. And to me, putting on my hat as a former governor, that was a no-brainer. I like discussions that are framed in fact. The emotions will always be there, but let's at least get the parameters set when we are not shouting at one another, when we're actually able to have a conversation. So we took it on, and it's to draw attention to the positive impact of nuclear power. That's what CASE is all about. But it is a voluntary organization. It's made up of a host of different entities, individuals, organizations, chambers of commerce, hospital associations, Wildlife Forever, different wildlife organizations have joined it. The real thinking behind it is that there's strength in numbers. When it comes time for policymakers to make the difficult decisions, and believe me, it's not easy to decide how you're going to meet future energy needs and how you're going to meet environmental needs at the same time, it helps to be able to look back and say, you know what, there's some people in my community who are thoughtful people, who are opinion leaders, who believe that we ought to be doing this. Or they're young people who see their future ahead of them with the decisions we make today, and they're saying, we ought to be thinking about this. It's up to the individual communities in the states to make the final decision, but it's a whole lot easier for those who have to make the decisions to lead the discussion if they know they're not out there alone. So we now have over 2,100 members of CASE, and I would urge any of you who might be interested to go to cleansafeenergy.org and look at it. There's no charge to be a member. There's nothing you're asked to do. It's just building that coalition that says to those who have to make the decision that, yes, nuclear is not an anathema. In fact, today we have Secretary Chu, our Secretary of Energy, who has called for nuclear to be part of the portfolio going forward. The President has talked about nuclear. It is part of the discussion, but it is not the silver bullet. And that's the thing that we have to all understand. We are going to need more recycling. We are going to need more renewables. We are always going to have coal. It's 50% of our power today, a little better than 50%. We're not going to get away from that. We're going to have oil and gas. We can use them better. We can be smarter about how we use them. Nuclear is 20% of the nation's power today. It should remain 20% of the nation's power. That's what we're talking about. If we could get it up to 25, that would be great, but to maintain 20% and look at a 21% increase in demand by 2030, we're going to need between 20 and 25 new nuclear reactors by 2030. The decisions are coming at all of us. The energy demands are real. They're not going to go away. The challenge to do that in a clean and safe and affordable way is, those challenges are enormous. But we believe, in CASE, that we can do that using nuclear power. With that, I will stop because I would be happy to answer any questions you might have, but I thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this ongoing discussion that you have had around climate and around energy. Thank you very much. Yes.
Coming out of Washington, what do you think will be in the cap and trade legislation that you might agree with, and what do you pretty much figure that you will not agree with?
Well, first of all, I don't come out of Washington. I live in New Jersey. I left Washington to go home. I'm going to stay there. No, it's a long way. Frankly, I will tell you, I'm not sure they're going to get a cap and trade bill this session because they're spending so much capital in the health care bill. I'm not sure you're going to get a cap and trade. The parts that concern me the most, I mean, Waxman-Markey is the bill they're talking about now, but that's not what's going to pass in the Senate. The Senate will be different. There's no two ways about that. There's some big holes, I believe, in the Waxman-Markey bill. The first is no credit for early action. There are many corporations and companies that have done a great deal to reduce their carbon footprint and to reduce their energy usage, and they did it because it was the right thing to do. I sit on the boards of a couple of them, and they have seen significant increase in the size of the company and in their revenues, and yet reduced in one company, they've reduced their absolute energy demands by 19%, their water demand by almost 20%, and their carbon footprint by 10 over the last 10 years, and nearly tripled the size of the company. They're doing things, but they're going to be at a severe disadvantage if the legislation, whatever passes after conference, does not include a recognition of that, particularly for those companies that have been part of things like Climate Leaders, which we started at EPA when I was there, and the DOE has a similar type of program. So they've been part of a federally recognized program to benchmark emissions and reductions. That, I think, has got to be part of it. The numbers, EPA did actually a scoring of the targets within the Waxman-Markey bill, and it would take, even allowing for increased conservation and renewables, 185 new nuclear reactors to meet the reduction targets in that bill by 2050. That's allowing, of course, for retirement of some of the older nuclear reactors that we have today, but it requires that much. And at the same time, they're still struggling with whether to identify the loan guarantees that they're talking about in the bill for green power, clean power, or renewable. Because nuclear is not a renewable power. Uranium is a finite resource. I mean, we have plenty of it, but it's still a finite resource. You cannot call it a renewable. It is green, and it is clean when it's producing power. It's the only form of base power, as I mentioned before, that doesn't release any regulated pollutants or greenhouse gases when producing power. So it would qualify for the loan guarantees, not loans, but loan guarantees. So that's a concern, but I just have no idea what a final piece of legislation would look like. If it doesn't include those things, though, I think we're going to really struggle. And the other issue that we have to be careful of as they draft this legislation is how proscriptive they get. If they do say clean and green energy and let the marketplace figure out which of that works, if they say in renewables, renewable, and don't say something like it's got to be corn-based ethanol, then we can be successful. When they start to get as prescriptive as Congresses want to do, and we'll say something like corn-based ethanol, that's where all our money and research is going to go, and that's where all our incentives are going to go, they cause enormous problems. They don't always anticipate all the unanticipated consequences, although anybody that's ever dealt with animals, and I grew up on a farm, would know what happens to field corn when you're not using it to fuel a car, you're using it to feed your cows and your pigs and your chickens, and if you don't have it for them, that's going to drive up other costs. So in any event, those are the things that I think have to be in a bill, and it's just we're a long way from knowing what we're going to have. However, I will also tell you that if they don't pass something, EPA is moving forward with a regulatory scheme to regulate carbon. Now, that will take much longer to implement, because the minute EPA comes out with a regulation, we're in court, just bang. It's a given. And you're usually sued by about 4 different sides. They're not just 2 sides to any issue, they're multiple sides, and they all want to sue EPA for whatever we propose. But they're going to move along that track. That's going to continue to move forward. Yeah?
Along with the building of new reactors and nuclear technology, are there any developments or technologies towards what you're going to do with the waste?
Oh, yeah. No, it's a very good question. Waste is a number one issue that gets brought up as an area of concern, and a very real one and an understandable one. I like to start by talking about the parameters of the issue with which we're dealing. If you took every spent nuclear rod that we have in the 104 nuclear reactors in the country today and put them end to end in one place, you fill up one football field to the height of the goalposts. We're not talking about something the size of the state of South Carolina, which many people think. And so it's a smaller, it's not as big as everybody envisions it. But where you see new technology coming into play, which will make have an enormous impact on this, is in recycling and reprocessing. We got out of the nuclear business back in the 1970s, and we really have not been doing anything significant since then. But in France, they've been reprocessing for a long time now. Japan has gotten into the reprocessing. France was reprocessing all of Japan's nuclear waste until Japan figured out they'd make money at this. There is about 96 to 97% fissionable material left in a spent nuclear rod. That's power just sitting there, being stored safely now on site on underground holding ponds or above ground reinforced concrete bunkers, but just being stored. Through reprocessing, you can reduce that to 2 to 3%, which means you have a much smaller amount that you have to deal with to store anywhere. Now that's highly enriched plutonium. It's got a lot of other bad things in it. Japan has just opened a new facility that they have finally figured out, and we are putting a lot of money into research to enhance this, how to ensure that what's left is non-weapons grade. And they have been able to, because that's been a big concern. What about when what you're left with is small and it's weapons grade? Isn't that going to lead to nuclear proliferation? Those are two very separate issues, I will tell you. As I say to people, we have all these reactors. We haven't brought any new reactors on in, some 30 years, close to 30. Well, we've had one new, it was already built, but we restarted it. It was shut down and restarted, but no new ones. And yet two of our biggest international concerns are a nuclear-armed Pakistan and nuclear-armed North Korea. So clearly what we do or don't do in bringing nuclear power on to service our domestic needs has no bearing whatsoever on the countries that want to have nuclear power, nuclear weapons. They're going to go ahead and do it. But clearly we've got to be concerned about this. And so the reprocessing offers a way to vastly reduce the amount that needs to be stored anywhere. But they are stored safely on site. However, the Congress said, and I think appropriately, that that's really not optimum. You don't want the 104 different sites around the country. That it'd be better to locate, they said one, they identified Yucca Mountain in Nevada as the site. The federal government has spent close to $5 billion on studying and preparing Yucca Mountain. But Yucca Mountain's in Nevada, and Harry Reid leads the Senate, and Harry Reid's from Nevada, and Yucca Mountain isn't going to happen while Harry Reid is there. And so that's an issue and a problem that Secretary Chu is trying to deal with. He's talking about finding some other sites, looking at some other sites for the waste, but really putting the emphasis on reprocessing, because for right now, the older sites, there are a few of them, a handful that have already been recertified for the next 30 years. So we're at least 30 years, at a minimum 30 years away from really needing to find a national repository. But I think we're going to find the answer to that much sooner. And to my mind, while it's an important question to ask and a serious issue, it's not one that should stop us going forward with future nuclear power, because those rods will be stored on site, and that's brought into the construction costs from the very beginning. Yes?
40 years ago, the environmental movement, really based on hysteria, not on facts, basically stopped the development of nuclear power in this country. And then 40 years later, now we're said that, that carbon's terrible. And they were actually, if you look at France, they probably are meeting a lot of their global warming requirements by using nuclear. Do you think the environmental movement has got any better vision or any better seeing into the future today than they had 40 years ago?
Well, they have a lot of concerns, and they're not all legitimate concerns. I mean, they have legitimate concerns and legitimate questions that are being asked of nuclear and things that they want to see happen, but absolutely. I mean, that's how Patrick Moore got to be a co-chair of CASE. He came from an extreme environmental organization. Greenpeace is one of the more extreme environmental organizations, and he said, we just can't keep saying, no, absolutely, we won't discuss this. That's not to say that the environmental movement is embracing nuclear, but more and more of them, I've talked with a number of them in national organizations, and they're at least saying we're going to hold our fire. You need to answer some questions for us. You need to answer the issue of what you're going to do about repository and safety. You need to show a commitment more of a, or get the utilities, we need to see more of a commitment to renewables and conservation. And I don't think that's an unfair thing to ask, frankly, that we do show that we are serious about that side of the equation as well. But they're beginning to say, we're going to have to be part of this discussion, but they're doing it reluctantly. I will tell you that. Even Al Gore has said that nuclear really needs to be part of the future, because you can't, in good conscience, raise the issue of climate change, the issue to the level that they have raised it, and understand that how you're going to meet your energy needs without including nuclear. And France is 85% nuclear. And Germany, for a long time, made it a point of saying that they were not nuclear, would never be nuclear, but they in fact bought most of their power from France. So that was a little bit of a game being played there. But today, on the European industrialized countries that have ratified Kyoto, they're all starting to look again at nuclear, because they can't meet their budgets or their targets under Kyoto without it. Merkel is talking about bringing new nuclear. Brown is talking about nuclear in the United Kingdom. So there are a number of countries that in the past had gainsaid nuclear and actually closed down nuclear reactors that are now having to take a second look at it, because they just can't figure out how they can continue to grow economically and meet their environmental goals and desires without including nuclear as part of that mix. Yeah, way back.
Is there anything that can be done to streamline the process of permitting, shorten the time of permitting? I understand it's at least a 10-year process.
Permitting process in the past for nuclear has been about a 10-year process or a 12-year process, but several things have happened. One is, of the 104 reactors we have today in this country, about 95 use different technologies. So there was no economy of scale. There was no going up a learning curve. Every time a utility came into the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with another reactor proposal, it was learning all over again. They started it at ground zero to get it back up, to understand what questions they needed to ask and what was happening. Today, there are probably 5. There are 2 GE, 1 Westinghouse, a French and a Japanese system that will be used. And worldwide, that's what people have decided. They all learned. The industry learned. This was a mistake, because they couldn't even train. They trained people on one nuclear reactor over here and then want to move them to somewhere else and within the company, and it was a different reactor entirely. They had to retrain them. There were no benefits there. So the industry itself worldwide has determined that, in fact, they're not going to have that kind of great diversity of reactors and technology. They're going to hone it down to these 5 that they're going to be looking at. 2 have been certified by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in this country, and they're looking at the licensing process for the other 3 to see if they make sense. That in and of itself will help speed the process through on the regulatory side of it, because, as I say, once they've seen the Westinghouse 1000, which is one of the ones proposed here, they'll know what to look for. They'll know what questions to ask. They'll know how to move it through. The other thing is that the NRC has decided to move and has moved toward what I would call, what we used to call a DBOM, Design, Build, Maintain, and Operate permit, all in one. In the past, what happened was when you came in and you wanted to build a nuclear reactor, you came in first for the site approval, then technology approval, and every step of the way you had to go back to the NRC for approval for that step. That took time, and time is money. The other side of it was it also meant for the interveners that they could bring another lawsuit, and that slowed things down dramatically. Now it's all going to happen up front. You have to come in with your siting, your technology, all the same questions, all the same standards have to be met, but you do it up front. And that gives the interveners a chance to see the full picture, but they have to do it all at once. It's up front when they have to make their opposition known, and that's when the court will play out. The court cases will play out. That in and of itself should speed up the process, which will be helpful in a number of ways. Not only will it reduce the time, it'll also help control the costs, so that cost estimates, which are between $6 and $8 billion per reactor today, will pretty well stay within those parameters. Because the other nice thing is those 5 technologies that I talked about, they're in use around the world now, in different places around the world, so they've seen them work. It's not as if they're going to uncover a whole lot of unanticipated issues when they start construction. So those things you can build. They're looking now, figuring it'll be about an 8-year process. It's taken up to 15 in the past. But in other countries in the world, they can do it in 4. I mean, you can build a reactor a lot faster. It's just that we have a process that requires more time and demands more time. But they have moved to streamline without compromising safety, which is, I think, paramount and should be in everybody's minds. Yeah.
Speaking of reactor sites, what sort of like regulatory action you have in choosing reactor sites that will people, per se, like if there's a community next to the area that would be like ideal for a reactor site, how will their concerns be like listened to or voiced?
How do you have a voice in whether it's an appropriate site or not? I'm
Well,
sorry.
yeah,
I
'cause
can't,
know in the-
can't quite hear under the arch there. No.
Like if one, like how are sites chosen? And if sites are chosen and there's a community nearby, will their voices or concerns be heard? Even if some people aren't exactly like for nuclear energy?
Oh, no, believe me, the voices are always heard, particularly the voices in opposition are always heard. Most of the sites that are being talked about today are putting a new reactor on a current site, and actually many of those were licensed when the first reactor went up, were licensed for a second reactor or a third reactor, so that the siting part was already done. The interesting thing, as I mentioned before, the people who live closest to nuclear reactors are the most positive. It's about 90% of the people living closest to nuclear reactors would be comfortable, are positive about nuclear, and would be comfortable with the idea of another reactor coming in on that site, because they've lived with them as neighbors. They've seen what it's done for the economy, and they've seen the power, and they know that it is affordable and it's reliable. So they tend to be amongst the most supportive. The latest study that I have seen, a Zogby poll, says that about 67% of the American people in general feel that nuclear should be part of our mix. Now, the whole purpose, and I would urge you to go to the cleansafeenergy.org, understanding that we are nuclear. There's no question about we're pro-nuclear. So while we try, Patrick Moore and I try to make sure, and I think we've done a very good job, and Case has as well, of keeping that site as straightforward and balanced and as fact-based as possible. You know, they're facts and they're facts. There are going to be people who disagree, and you need to know that going in and have that in your mind as you look at it. But look at it and see the questions that are there and the questions you need to have asked, because it's ultimately going to come down to a decision. There are going to be trade-offs. There are pros and cons with anything. I did a panel with T. Boone Pickens about a month before he pulled the plug on his wind farm. And I am all for wind energy. I think it's important. But for his wind farm, which was going to generate as much power as an average nuclear reactor, he needed 200,000 acres. A nuclear reactor has a footprint, and that's because they buy a lot of buffer land around of a square mile. And it would require between $10 and $12 billion, whereas a nuclear reactor is 6 to 8. So it doesn't mean you don't go forward with nuclear. It just means understand that's going to be expensive too, and you're going to need a lot of land to do it until we improve the technology enough to enable them to generate more power with less of an impact on the land. They're trade-offs. And people need to know what the facts are in order to be able to make an intelligent decision about what trade-offs am I willing to live with, what makes sense for my community. And I see somebody standing right here, and it is ready to say the hook. So thank you all very, very much.